Well, it's a great privilege to follow Hans, and those of you who are looking for a detailed exposition on the variety of suggestions for reforming the Security Council should turn to Hans's website, as indeed I did last night, to see all his ideas, and they're absolutely tremendous. So I commend them to you. But my contribution, I want to make something from somebody who's much less intimate knowledge of the UN structures than the other members of the panel, but as a practicing politician, and try to look at this issue in terms of what actually might work, which is not aspiration, because this is a catch-22 situation, isn't it? How do you persuade the reform of an organisation when the thing you're trying to reform has a vested interest in not reforming? So how do you get a reform of the structures of the United Nations which involve the diminution or elimination of the veto power of the Security Council members, or the permanent members, and how do you get that past the permanent members who won't accept it? So it's catch-22. So let's get to fundamentals about how you might do that. Firstly, I was watching the film Ban Ki-moon documentary yesterday, which many of you have seen, are quite diplomatic. And there's two things struck me. One was the intimate connection of the 8th Secretary General with the organisation. Now, he obviously grew up in South Korea. He was in the situation where the UN was very helpfully there, present, and the saviour of him, his family, and many of their friends and neighbours. But nonetheless, I would underrate the attachment of millions of people around the planet, people who the United Nations has touched. Because it's a great mistake, obviously, as nobody in this panel would do, to think just because the Security Council doesn't function properly and doesn't rise to occasions, or has, as Hans pointed out, one of the permanent members violating the self-determination of another member of the United Nations by the invasion of Ukraine. Just because these things are happening doesn't mean the UN isn't functioning in many, many ways, with tens of thousands of UN employees doing good work on a daily basis across a range of United Nations activities. But nonetheless, there is a danger that if the UN stands immobilised, as it does at the present moment, as Gaza is demolished brick by brick and 20,000 or more people, innocent people, have already died. If the UN stands immobilised when there's a world crisis such as that, then the UN will be brought into disrepute. So let's get back to the first principles. That intimate connection that Ban Ki-moon had with the UN, that support, inherent support that the United Nations has for many people. There was also a section in that film, incidentally, which had Ban Ki-moon at a pop concert in Central Park. And there's a good illustration that the United Nations for young people is a pretty cool organisation. You know, it's regarded as a good organisation, particularly in terms of the work of that Secretary General in particular on climate change. An association with the issue which grabs the attention of more young activism across the planet than any other. So the United Nations has a good rep and is a cool organisation. So my first suggestion is a very practical one. How do you mobilise that and make sure that there's even more of an understanding of the work of the United Nations across the planet? Now, as you know, as everybody in this room will know, the United Nations has a very good educational website. It has all sorts of educational tools, help for teachers and the rest of it. But how would it be if it was to be made a condition of membership of all members of the General Assembly that United Nations Studies was part of the school curricula in each country? Now, I don't think it would be easy for any country to refuse to do that. I mean, why would you want to be a member of an organisation which you value so highly, and every independent state in the world values their membership of the United Nations, and not be prepared to sign up for such an initiative? So it would be an interesting initiative to do, because it would spread the word of the United Nations to reach in parts that it doesn't reach at the present moment. Of course, some countries would abuse it, some countries would misuse it, some countries would betray the UN in different ways. Of course they would. But by and large, on the whole, and that's how you should judge these things, it would help that mobilisation of support, popular support for the United Nations as a concept. So that would build up pressure for the UN to be an active organisation that was able to respond to crisis. And the second thing is in terms of getting a resolution, getting a proposal for reform, which would have a chance of getting through the veto power of the permanent members. And to do that, I think you need something which is not the absolute, not the perfect, something that makes essential progress. And I think they are the best opportunity, the best thing that might prevail on the permanent members is an analogy with a bicameral parliament. If you take the United Kingdom, for example, of an unelected second chamber, which, let's forget the absurdity of that for a second, but just look at the structure. In the United Kingdom, in that bicameral parliament, the House of Commons, the elected House, has the right to propose, and then the unelected House has the right to say no. But if the elected House goes back and insists, then that effective veto of the House of Lords falls. Now, you could arrange something which didn't depend on a simple majority, because you can't command action, whether it be a military intervention through peacekeeping or even sanctions, on a bare majority. You couldn't do that, because then you could have a situation where 55% of the world wanted to intervene on one side and 45% wanted to intervene on the other side, and that would be ridiculous. But where you had something like a 90% vote on the General Assembly, something like the vote on Gaza recently, then that could, under a system, overpower a veto. And if that was the proposal, or something like that was the proposal, it would be difficult for an individual member who has the veto at the present moment to withstand that, because the power, it would be so inherently reasonable. And there have been various instances, of course, where if we take Russia or America, with the two focal points of problem at the present moment, both have had instances where they've been on 90%, and both have instances where they've been in the 10%. So a proposal like that might have a bit of purchase. But I do like the idea of building up the popular grassroots support for the United Nations across the planet, for making it obligatory to have it in the school studies. And one final point I want to make is this: that I was, for my sins, reading President Trump's addresses to the United Nations recently. And it struck me as I was reading them that the Donald totally misconceives what the UN is. I mean, I'm not talking about his attitudes to a whole variety of subjects. That's irrelevant to this point. He actually believes the United Nations is inherently a globalist organisation. Well, of course it's not. The United Nations is what it says on the tin. It's the United Nations. It's an international organisation. So how do you persuade an organisation who is based on that, on the defence of sovereignty and sovereign rights and human rights, as Hans reminded us, how do you persuade it to take effective globalist action? Then you have to have a mechanism like the one I suggested, and you have to build up the popular pressure which is necessary to prevail on forces who otherwise will maintain their own self-interest and probably take us all to perdition in the meantime. Thank you.